From FingerLakes1.com, I'm Josh Durso, and this is Inside the FLX. Today, our program is all about politics. The Trailblazers PAC was designed to educate citizens and candidates and get more folks politically engaged. PAC-endorsed candidates are described as a new brand of civically engaged office holders at the local level who give government back to the people who pay for it. Leslie Danks Burke, who founded the Trailblazers PAC in January of 2017, is our guest today. She is no stranger to politics herself. Thank you so much for being here, Leslie.
I'm delighted to be here. Thank you, Josh.
So I guess let's start off by just having you give a little bit of background on you personally, how you got involved in politics and where this idea might have come from.
Sure. I think I've been involved in politics since my childhood. I remember being a little girl with my dad, a member of the local political committee, and he would haul me up and down the streets of Denver, Colorado, where I grew up, in my little red wagon. And my job was to sort campaign literature and try and get the packets together before he got to the next home door. And so this idea of being involved and engaged in local politics has really been part of my life for a long time, as it is for so many folks who participate in local politics. And my view is that local office holders are closest to voters. They are the front lines of democracy. And unfortunately, I think our founding fathers might be a little bit disappointed in us. We've lost track of that, and we are not paying as much attention to local politics as we should be. And Trailblazers PAC aims to reconnect voters with democracy, one front porch at a time.
So you ran for office yourself. So
I did.
You lived this experience once. I'm curious what that contributed to the actual brainstorming of this project.
A huge amount. I ran for New York State Senate in 2016, which 2016 turned out to be a year that was very different from what a lot of people on the national stage were expecting. But actually, if you look at how citizens, how Americans have been engaging with democracy, 2016 was not that surprising. It was, the logical point of progression from some movements that have been shaping American politics for a long time. I ran for New York State Senate. I came in second. I did not win that seat, but our race was an outlier in very hyper-partisan 2016. What happened in 2016 was that mostly candidates of the Democratic persuasion did slightly worse than expected, and Republicans, voted for Republicans and Democrats voted for Democrats. What ended up happening in our campaign was that in a district that was 32% Democratic, our Democratic campaign ended up getting 45% of the vote. And that was a real outlier. Obviously, I still didn't win, but getting 13 points above the base Democratic registration didn't happen too many places. I'm the first person to say that is not candidate driven. I was a pretty good candidate, I thought, but no candidate is 13 points good. That was due to the style of campaign that we ran. And what we decided to do immediately after that race was to translate what we call front porch politics into a program that works in communities all over two states, New York and Pennsylvania, to re-engage voters with democracy.
So beyond the surface, beyond educating citizens and the people who want to run, what do you guys find as far as what kind of learning curve there is between people who want to run and established candidates who are tried and true and more likely to win races in a local election where turnout might lack a little bit?
There's a big learning curve, and we get so much news at the national and at the state level that your everyday American actually knows a lot more about how Congress works and how national politics works than sometimes they do about how local politics works. And I certainly do commend you, Josh, and this program, because you're paying attention to the piece of our republic that is closest to voters, which is the local political scene. But that doesn't happen everywhere. There isn't that sort of news accessibility for Americans. And so we generally don't know, who's running for local office. We don't know what those folks do. We don't know when those races are, but those are the people who set your taxes. Those are the people who fill the potholes. Those are the people who decide where your kids are going to go to school. I mean, those are really people who are having a real impact on our day-to-day lives, and I think we need to get more engaged there.
What's the first thing that you guys tell people as far as maybe they're on the fence. They're thinking about it. They're close. You just have to kind of get them the rest of the way there. What's one of the first things you tell people when it comes to convincing them to get involved and to, not even if it's just running for an elected office, but just attending meetings and being more engaged?
It's our duty as citizens. It really is. And the second piece is that you're qualified. Anybody who is living in their community and participating in their community is qualified to comment on that community. And that's what our forefathers expected. We're a democracy, we're a democratic republic of the people. The people are supposed to be who's making the decisions. And if you're participating on a listserv about whether there's going to be construction in your neighborhood or not, or if you're interested in how many shops there are going to be on Main Street and what sort of shops those are going to be, those are conversations that you are qualified to participate in. So interestingly, one of the first hurdles that we have to get candidates over is helping them understand they can do this. And this year has been very interesting because so many people are engaged in politics and excited about politics for 2018. We see just a flood of people running for national office, running for Congress, running for, the U.S. Senate all across the United States. It's amazing how it's sometimes harder to convince people that they have the skill set to run for local office. On the local issues, you got to know your stuff, and people recognize that. So
I want you to expand on that a little bit because I think it's interesting. It does seem like sometimes you can skate through a state or federal election without being super, super knowledgeable about little individual issues. But you don't get that luxury at the local level. Just expand on that a little bit because I think that's something that a lot of people probably don't understand or think about very often.
Well, your neighbors know the real deal on the local level, right? So they're going to hold you accountable. And if you're talking about whether potholes are going to get filled in a particular neighborhood, you better know the names of the streets you're talking about. Whereas on the national level, as you say, I think you can sort of gloss over and look at it in a more big picture format. That said, we should be holding our elected officials accountable, and we should be asking them to know their stuff. And what Trailblazers PAC really focuses on is making sure that our local office holders are focused on clean government, making sure that our local office holders are accountable to their voters. And that doesn't necessarily happen at the national level. It doesn't always happen at the state level. But beginning at the local level is where we can really start to make change. We believe in trickle-up politics.
So walk us through that idea, clean government, clean operation. What does that sort of lend itself to?
Well, I think that there's a real sense in America today that there's a lot of corruption in government at all levels. That was a huge theme in the 2016 campaign. The two presidential candidates were beginning to throw a lot of barbs at each other about who was more corrupt and who was more needing to go to jail. And those were accusations.
Great thing for an election to be centered around.
Those were accusations on both sides. And Trailblazers PAC is a nonpartisan organization. We stand with any candidate who is willing to do more than law requires with respect to clean government. And the way they can demonstrate that during their campaigns is they can walk the talk on campaign finance transparency. So candidates, don't often have an opportunity unless they're already an incumbent to vote on particular issues. And so they can make a lot of promises, but we don't know whether they'll hold to those promises once they're elected. They do have an obligation to file their campaign finance disclosure reports, and so that's a test case for whether they're going to actually walk this talk. We ask them to disclose more than law requires, to 100% disclose where all of their money comes from and where they're spending their campaign money. And we believe that is as good as we can find a predictor of whether they're going to hold to that promise once they get into office.
It's a really interesting discussion right there, because everyone talks about getting the bad money out of politics, getting the corporate money out of politics to make it a little more true to what people want and on the ground. What do you think the answer is there as far as creating a better arena for politics to happen, for elections to happen, so it is more fair for everyone involved.
Money in politics is a huge problem. There is no doubt about that. And given recent decisions of the Supreme Court, it's likely to stay the way it is, I think, for some period of time. But what we as individuals can do is change our own behavior within that system. And so if we are able to ask our local elected officials, and hopefully they will then also ask their state level, or we could hold our state level and our federal level officials accountable as well, to change their own behavior, that creates pressure in the competitive process that is elections. So if one candidate steps forward and says, I'm running a 100% clean government campaign. I am fully disclosing all of my contributions, and I am taking a pledge to finance my campaign with at least 1% of the voting households in my district, which is what we ask them to do. And we ask them to run their campaign not through any political party committee, but through an independent committee. If they do those things and they advertise that they do those things, that then puts pressure on their opponent to do those things as well. So one way we change the process in the United States, obviously, is through Supreme Court decisions like Citizens United. Another way we change the process in the United States is through legislation. Congress has talked a lot about changing campaign finance, but they haven't actually done it. New York State is one of the worst states in the country in terms of non-transparency and an inability to find out how our elected officials are financed. And what we can do as citizens is begin to hold them accountable in the absence of those legislative or those judicial changes.
How frustrating is it to see at the state level the gridlock that exists, specifically for New York State, because it is something that is talked about every single day. And year after year, it seems like we get the promise that change is coming, but then it doesn't really actually happen.
Well, look who needs to make the change, right? It's the folks who've already benefited from the system that got them in there in the first place. And you're right, New York State has a real problem. It's a bipartisan problem. It's a nonpartisan problem. The leader of the New York State Senate had to go to jail because, of misuse of funds. And the same thing is true of Sheldon Silver, the Democratic leader of the Assembly. So it's a Democrat and a Republican problem. And it's something that, we need to address. We hear promises all the time, but those promises aren't going to come to fruition unless the citizens start making it clear to our elected officials that this is our priority.
So then what if, Claire, I just want to clarify, you're basically saying that if politics becomes more grassroots and focuses on the people, these systemic issues will weed themselves out, will correct themselves, and it won't require as much legal action or legislation to fix it.
I'm saying that elected officials choose to focus on what is going to get them reelected. And if we as citizens say, this is what we care about, we really care about whether you are following through on your clean government promises or whether it's just lip service, they'll start to pay attention to that.
And just out of curiosity, what is the success rate as you guys have moved through the process of getting into communities and actually getting people thinking in this way? Because it seems like for a lot of people, even if they believe in it, they may be saying, oh, that's just somebody promising something else that isn't going to actually happen. How much of that do you guys have to compensate for when you're out on the ground?
Well, we're really proud of how our candidates did in 2017. We started early in 2017. We hit the ground running. We worked with about 130 candidates across the two states. A full 24 of those ended up making it all the way through our mentorship program and ended up getting our endorsement and fully followed through on all of our program. Those candidates won at a rate of 58%. And that's pretty exciting. The piece that was even more exciting for us internally was that wherever our candidates ran, whether they won or not, voter turnout went up. It was 14% higher than in comparable 2017 districts. And that's really interesting because even at a time when people are showing up in marches all over the place and sending, postcards by the thousands to their elected officials and phone calls are through the roof, voter turnout is still pretty abysmal in New York State. But for us to be able to demonstrate that where candidates employed front porch politics, where they took these concrete steps to connect voters with democracy, the voter turnout went up. That's an exciting trend for us to see.
Now, looking ahead, obviously, some pretty big elections this year. Probably none more interesting than the New York 23, excuse me. Tom Reed is looking like the front runner, but at the same time, you just can't tell given the circumstances and given the larger political climate at play. What's your assessment of what you've seen so far out of the Democratic primary side as those candidates are campaigning toward what would probably be a multiple candidate primary day at the end of June?
Yeah. Well, full disclosure, I was a candidate myself in the Democratic primary in 2012, which was the last time that there was a Democratic primary in the 23rd Congressional District. It was myself, Nate Shinagawa, and a woman named Melissa Dobson. And Nate ended up beating me and Melissa fair and square. And my role in that campaign was then I turned my energy 100% to Nate's campaign and helped the Nate Shinagawa campaign get within 4 points of besting Congressman Tom Reed. I tell you that because my perspective on primaries is that they build the community. Democracy is a messy process. It was designed to be that way. It's a whole lot of people making a decision together. But when it plays out the way our forefathers envisioned that it would, through open, contested debates, you get more people engaged and your candidates end up being stronger. So what I see playing out right now on the Democratic side, and I don't have a favorite in that race, but I do see that all of them who are announced candidates are doing everything they can to make each other stronger and to get folks engaged all over the district. That's all to the good from my perspective. Whether whether Congressman Tom Reed sees it that way or not, I don't know. But I would hope that he would think that this is a good thing, that people are engaged in democracy in his district and are participating and are coming forward to share their ideas.
A legitimate question, though, is from the end of June, I believe 26th is the official primary day, June 27th until Election Day. Is that enough time to mount the type of campaign that would be necessary and to garner enough support, especially from the middle and from the political right, we'll call it, to win a district that, Democrats are sitting in a pretty significant deficit as far as registered voters go? Yeah.
Whether it's enough or not, I think that you can always use the time in advance of that primary to build your campaign. And that's what I would really commend to all the candidates in the field. I'm sure that Congressman Reed is using this opportunity to build up his general election campaign. He doesn't have a primary opponent as far as I can tell. And that means that he's 100% focused on the general election. The candidates on the Democratic side should also be using this opportunity to build up their general election campaign. And just a footnote on the timing, back in 2012 when I ran for this congressional seat, the primary was switched that year from being in early September to, along with the state primaries, to being in June. That was the first year that it was switched. And that switch happened after Mr. Shinagawa, Ms. Dobson, and I announced our campaigns. And so that was a real monkey wrench in the machinery to announce your campaign and then all of a sudden find out that your primary race was 3 months earlier than you had expected it to be. That said, I think that it was valuable to be able to have that primary race concluded in June and then allow the congressional general election to play out for the next 6 months.
So jumping back into the local election space, what are some of the big, I'll call them transparency issues that you guys see in local government that you really, beyond the campaigning and once you get into actual governing, what are some of those issues that you guys as an organization watch for as sort of indicators of, something might not be going totally right here?
It runs the range, Josh, from, issues like the ones that I know that this news station has called attention to, which are not publicizing notices of meetings. If the public doesn't know that a meeting's happening, how much can the public really participate in that meeting? So you'll have relatively small concerns like that, all the way up to people absconding with money, embezzling funds from their local municipalities, nepotism, partisanship, where you're handing over particular elected or appointed positions to people who are your friends. That becomes really problematic all across the local office holder scene, almost more than at the national and the state level. We hear a lot about nepotism or corruption or problematic financial behavior at the national and the state level, but that's why it's less rampant there, is because people are paying attention to it. It's amazing how often it goes on at the local level.
Now, to that end, what can be done because one of the big perceived issues with local government is that you have elected officials who really oftentimes don't have a solid understanding of the day-to-day function and doing the day-to-day work of actually governing. How do candidates and thereby elected officials become more educated on actually governing?
They've got to do the homework, right? And, we have national office holders who don't completely understand what they're getting into when they begin to hold national office. So it happens all the time. You have to work at it. You have to get in there and make sure that you remember who pays your salary and who your boss is, and that's the people whose tax dollars are going into the fund that you're administering or going directly to your salary. And you have to do the job, do the work. By the same token, just as we see so much corruption at the local level that we don't know about, there's also a phenomenal number of local office holders who get out there and very quietly and patiently do the hard work of making sure we can all live in a society together. Mm-hmm. That's what government is. It's setting the rules so that we can all get along. That's how I explained it to my kindergartners when my kids were in kindergarten. This is what mama does, is she helps figure out what the rules are. We all need them.
What do you say, because as I was going through social media, coming up with the background on how we were going to approach this interview, one of the things that sort of kept popping up from time to time was that the Trailblazers PAC does not give the same consideration to conservative candidates as they do what is the perceived liberal candidate. Obviously, we live in super polarized times, so obviously everything is a little bit skewed right now. But what is your typical response to that notion that if you are a middle or leaning right candidate, that you can be considered part of the Trailblazers PAC just as easily? I
would turn it right back around at you and ask the question, why is it that so few, literally in the single digits, conservative candidates have reached out to us for money? We are a nonpartisan PAC. We have a nonpartisan board of directors. There's a lot of organizations out there that put themselves forward as nonpartisan, but when you look at their boards of directors, they're not bipartisan, actually. They don't actually make that effort. We are not getting the requests for funding from conservative candidates. As much as I send emails and call out to local Republican leaders and talk to them as often as possible, we simply don't get the applications. We had 130 candidates apply, and as I said, single digits were applying from the conservative end of the spectrum.
Did that surprise you to any degree? Just as you're walking into this venture, knowing that you want to stay down the middle and you want to be that nonpartisan factor? I
think that it's a factor of American politics right now that the Republicans are in charge, right? The Republicans have the presidency, the U.S. Senate, the U.S. Congress, and they control 32 state legislatures. As a result, they're not looking for new ways to win elections. So when you're already winning the game, you're not going to be as desperate to find new opportunities and new ways to do it. So, I think that they're just not as excited about following our program because they think they don't need it. Mm-hmm. I would dispute that. I would argue that they need it just as much as we do. And what I say to conservative leaders all the time is take a look at New York City, where the Democrats have it locked up. And how's that working out for us? Not too well, frankly. The fact that there is very rarely a substantial race in New York City between a Republican and a Democrat, where there's equal opportunity on both sides. You have two great candidates who are duking it out on their particular perspectives on politics. You don't see that in New York City, and I got to tell you, as a result, corruption is through the roof. Mm-hmm. This two-party system that we have in America may not be perfect, but one of the things that it does do is hold us accountable to each other, and it's part of our checks and balances system, and we've got to make sure that both parties are as strong as they can be.
So looking forward through the rest of this election cycle, what are some of the things that you and the Trailblazers PAC as a whole are sort of focusing on, looking at, earmarking for 2018 as being important?
One of my top priorities personally as the founder and president of Trailblazers PAC is exactly what you just suggested, figuring out ways that I can say to my Republican friends, hey, look, you might be on top right now, but the usual path in American politics is what goes up comes back down. So you might want to look into what we're doing for your future. That's one of my real top priorities is to make that persuasive case to my fellow Republicans.
And the last question before we get you out of here, how can folks get involved? How can they get involved with what you guys are doing? They probably see or are listening to this and saying, hey, that sounds pretty good. What can I do?
Go to trailblazerspac.com. Take a look at our website. Send us a note if you know of any candidates who are running for local office anywhere in New York State or Pennsylvania. We work across both states. Let those candidates know to apply for our funding. One of the amazing things is that there is no list of all the races being held when you talk about transparency, just as a first start, it'd be nice to know all the races that are being held in either state. We don't have that list. It doesn't exist. So people have to find out about us sort of through word of mouth, and we have to find out about them the same way. So please send candidates our way, ask for our funding, come to participate in our workshops. Our next workshop is March 24th in State College, Pennsylvania, on the Penn State campus there, and we're looking forward to it.
All right, well, I really appreciate you coming in today, and I'm sure we'll have you in again to talk about some of these races coming up in 2018 as they develop and the candidates become a little more solidified. So thanks very much.
I'd love it. And go vote.
Yes, go vote for sure. Well, that's going to do it for us today. I'd like to thank Leslie, our listeners, and of course FingerLakes1.com for making this program possible. Inside the FLX airs Sundays at 7 p.m. on Spectrum, channel 1304, and is available on iTunes, Stitcher, and the FingerLakes1.com app. Thanks for listening, and we will catch you next time.